everybody. It is September 29th, 2022 as I'm recording this, and Hurricane Ian is passing through. I became a prepper for this event. I didn't want to become one of those toilet paper people at the beginning of COVID, but I did run out and get some water. You could only buy 2 at a time, which is actually what I normally do. I get 1 case of water for my house and 1 case of water for my vehicle. Yes, I'm one of those idiots who pay for water when it's free from the tap. Down here, they have these giant cinder block homes. They don't have like siding or anything like that on it. It's just like gigantic blocks of concrete. And I'm assuming the reason they do that is because it's safe in hurricanes. Sometimes they paint those blocks like bright colors, which is kind of neat. Something you see kind of in rougher neighborhoods a lot. But it's not exclusive to rougher neighborhoods. I've actually seen some nice mansions being built the same way. When I first got down here, somebody was showing me around and I said, wow, I've never seen cinder block homes before. And he was like, really? I'm like, yeah, that's very unique. And when I first got down to Florida, I saw these trees that had this like stuff hanging off of it. And I asked this guy who was showing me around, what kind of tree is that? What is that? And he said, I have no idea what that tree is called. It was actually let me look here, an epiphytic flowering plant called Spanish moss. It's like really kind of cool. It's like, it's almost like curly blonde hair. And just like Lenny, I can't help but like touch it when I see it. It's almost like spaghetti almost. Like if spaghetti was curly, like angel hair, like a really thin pasta almost. I watched this show once called Limmy's Show, Limmy's show, where this kind of like drug addict found an adventure by jumping on a bus and not paying for it and went to a suburb of Edinburgh. And he was so excited about it. And he sits next to this girl on a bus and he asks, hey, is this place any good? And she responds, yeah, I've lived here my whole life. Yogurt, born and bred. Mind-boggling. He asks, so you've never once wondered what Yoker is like? And she gives him a dirty look. But I started laughing when that guy who was showing me around didn't know what that tree was called, because I thought the exact same thing. Like imagine never wondering what that spaghetti stuff was hanging off of that tree. Later I looked it up and I found out that it was called Spanish moss, the spaghetti type stuff. And it had nothing to do with like a specific tree. It actually is its own thing. And that it grows on southern live oaks and magnolias. So it wasn't the tree, it was the stuff that was hanging off the tree. But I was half asking the right question because, yeah, it does tend to grow off these 2 specific trees, magnolias and southern live oaks. I guess I'm kind of nerdy. I like birds and NASA and rockets and stuff like that, you know? It's one of the first things I noticed when I moved down here were the different birds, the anhingas, the Muscovy ducks, ugly as sin, the white ibis, the herons, which, you know, we had in Cleveland, but they're different down here. Snowy egrets, pelicans. When I was a kid, I used to watch space shuttle launches on TV, and I always dreamed of being up close and in person to see one for myself one day. Now, as an adult, even though the space shuttle program ended years ago, I find myself living with where modern-day space agencies launch their rockets from. The problem that I found was those launches usually happen on days when I have to work, and it's kind of difficult to be there and be here at the same time. One recent Saturday morning, I happened to be surfing the web, and I noticed that SpaceX actually had a launch happening the next day. And it was something I was able to go to, like, yay, you know? But still, it was going to be tricky because the launch was scheduled like really early in the morning, like 8 a.m. And the launch site was well over 2 hours away from where I live. Like to get there in time, I was going to have to wake up by 4 o'clock a.m. And I usually don't even go to sleep until after midnight. But I really wanted to go, so I completely rearranged my weekend schedule so that I could make it happen. I pretty much sacrificed my Saturday so that I could wake up on Sunday, you know, to experience this incredible thing, hopefully at least. I forced myself to go to bed at around 9:30 p.m., which isn't really an easy task for me. I actually had to use some NyQuil to do it. Inexplicably, my cell phone started chiming loudly over and over again right around 3:30 a.m., which started giving me these random, repeated, nonstop notifications. There were like 7 of them in 2 minutes. One of those notifications was for something called Sudoku, which I believe is an online game, which I've never played before. I didn't even know it was on my phone, but all these notifications started blowing up at 3:30 a.m. and it was like infuriating. Why would whoever programmed my phone think that it was important for me to get a Sudoku update at 3:30 a.m.? But I couldn't go back to sleep. I was up for good, which surprisingly turned out to be a good thing because I usually keep my cell phone on silent, but I had been expecting this important phone call the night before and I kind of forgot to turn off the volume. I was like so angry that I lost this half hour of sleep. But only up until the moment when I realized that I had actually gotten so distracted the night before by that phone call that I completely forgot to set my alarm for the rocket launch. And otherwise, I just would have slept right through it. If not for that amazing Sudoku notification. Weird. Anyways, I was really tired, but waking up a half hour early actually gave me a little extra time to get ready. So I packed my lunch, I took a shower, and I hit the road. And I traveled through that early morning darkness until, the sun rose up over the horizon, over the shore. And I finally arrived at the Kennedy Space Center around 6:55 a.m. The gates were supposed to open at 7 a.m., but they were apparently starting to allow people in much earlier, like a half hour early, which was probably a really good thing because even still, there was this long line of cars in front of me, and it took at least a half hour to get to the front of the line. It was like 7:30 by the time I got to the front gate. So in the short amount of time that I had before the launch, I still needed to find a place to park, get a ticket to enter the Kennedy Space Center itself, and go through security and walk to wherever the north viewing area was, which I thought would be further than it actually was. But somehow I arrived there with time to spare. I thought I was going to have to walk a long way to get wherever that viewing site was, but it was actually just right behind one of the main buildings, like right up front, really close to where I parked. At first, I thought that was a really good thing because I wouldn't have to walk too far. And I made it there in plenty of time for the launch, but it became really obvious really quickly that this viewing area that they had was really, really lame. First of all, the viewing area was kind of small in relation to the amount of people who were trying to squeeze into this compact space. There was this AstroTurf lawn where people were allowed to sit and watch, surrounded by 3 sets of bleachers, the kind that you would see at a high school football game. But the bleachers were really small, and there really wasn't enough space for everyone who wanted a seat, even really early in the morning. So I chose to sit on the AstroTurf lawn, closest to where the launch was supposed to be. It didn't take a long time for me to look around and come to the conclusion that we all kind of had a crappy view. I quickly came to terms with the fact that we apparently couldn't actually see the launch site from this specific viewing area. What the heck, man? I thought back to watching those space shuttle launches as a kid, and it always seemed to me like the people on TV had this amazing view of the launch pad. That's what I thought I was paying for. Getting into the Kennedy Space Center was like $80, plus another $10 for parking. This was not an inexpensive experience. And for what? It was the crappiest possible view of a rocket launch that you could possibly have. And it was absolutely infuriating. I looked around and I noticed that not only was the launch site hidden by a bunch of trees on the horizon, but we were also sitting behind a metal fence, as well as some telephone wires that lined the nearby road, which would not only make the rocket harder to see as it lifted off, but it made for a really ugly view as well. Any photos that I might choose to take would kind of be ugly, Really. Who wants telephone lines in their rocket launch photos, The view would have literally been better from 50 feet away, outside of the complex on the road. It was almost as if by going into the Kennedy Space Center itself, the viewing area, I had actually paid for a worse view than people on the outside would have had for free. And honestly, the only reason that I paid to get into the Kennedy Space Center that day was to get a great view of the rocket launch, which I was obviously not going to get. As I waited for the big moment, there was a guy there who was narrating the countdown activities. He told us which direction to look to see the launch, and so everyone had kind of set themselves up accordingly. And then he explained to everyone that the launch had been delayed by an hour and a half until 9:30 a.m. instead of 8. I had just checked the countdown clock on the Kennedy Space Center website before I left home, just to make sure that it was still happening before I left, before I drove so far. And it didn't show any sort of delay, so I figured it must have been postponed like during the drive recently, while I was traveling, I went back to the Kennedy Space Center website on my phone and I noticed that their clock was still counting down to an 8 a.m. launch. They hadn't even bothered to update it. I later found out that SpaceX had announced the change of the launch time a full 2 days previously, and the Space Center knew about this all along, but they didn't care enough to change the launch time on the website. I left at like 3:30 a.m. Why did I hurry so much to arrive at 7 for a 9:30 launch? My frustrations were mounting very quickly. However, this delay did give me plenty of time to sit and research other spots where I could have had a much better view for free. How is it possible that the Kennedy Space Center has the worst view of the rocket launch, Absolute madness. The guide who was there told us that if the sun, which was rising at the time, right in our faces, if the sun was at 12 on the horizon, then the launch site would be at 11 o'clock. So we'd be staring almost like straight into the sun to watch this rocket launch. But on the bright side, the delayed launch meant that the sun had time to rise, saving our eyes from certain blindness. As I sat there, I could just start to feel my skin baking in the Florida heat. Screw this, I thought. I'm not sitting through this for an hour and a half. I just decided to go back to my vehicle. I'd been in such a hurry to get to the launch site by 8 a.m. that I decided not to bring things like a camp chair or my journal or sunscreen, so I really had nothing to do to occupy my time for an hour and a half. But as I was walking towards my vehicle, my plans quickly changed when I noticed that people were sneaking in the back door of one of the exhibits, which I suppose was unofficially open, so I just followed them in. I looked up once I got inside, and there it was. The actual Space Shuttle Atlantis in all of its glory. I came into the room from underneath the spacecraft's belly, and I couldn't believe how big it was. It had never occurred to me before that the majority of the space shuttle was actually just the cargo bay. The front basically consisted of a cockpit and living quarters, which was a lot smaller than I ever imagined it would be, at least compared to the shuttle's overall size. The rear was basically made up of rocket engines, which, again, by comparison to the size of the shuttle bay, was really just like a fraction of the spacecraft. At least this part was a really great experience, and I didn't know it yet, but after the venue officially opened at 10 a.m., it would start to get way more crowded as a lot more people arrived later in the morning. And at this early hour that I was in there, it was basically just me and a few other people walking around, taking it all in without huge crowds. And that was a special treat, I guess. As 9:30 approached, I went back outside and the launch viewing area was totally packed. Too packed to even get back into. I didn't care, though, by that point. Why would I want to get back into the area where the view was so awful? I walked up like this tiny small hill to get to a spot where I thought I'd get a decent view of the launch. The guide earlier had given us a pretty decent idea of which direction to look out for the rocket, so I positioned myself accordingly. In a spot where I had this wide open lawn to the east of me, the direction that we were told the rocket was going to be taking off from. There were so many spots within a few feet of where we were standing where I could have had a much better view of the launch, but most of them were closed off to the public. It was almost as if the Kennedy Space Center was going out of their way to make the view of the launch as lousy as possible. As I ventured up the hill, a woman and her little boy started walking beside me, and we began discussing our strategies for where to stand. I told her how disappointed I was, and she said, well, this is the only time we'll ever be here, so we don't get to come back. So we're just going to have to make the most of it. And honestly, that's what infuriated me about this experience. I mean, I live just a few hours away, and as disappointed as I was, I could come back at any point. But so many of these people that came here to the Kennedy Space Center had like European accents. They had probably traveled from overseas for this once-in-a-lifetime experience. And this is what they got. A crappy view of a rocket launch, blocked by trees and a fence, in a tiny, overcrowded viewing area. This was most likely their one and only time that they would ever see a rocket launch. And this experience was worse than lame. As I stood there waiting for the takeoff, I pulled out my smartphone and I started playing the live feed from the SpaceX YouTube channel, which was giving me and the people around me live updates since we were all forced to stand so far away from the main video screen by this point. Others seemed to really appreciate me playing the audio to the launch feed, and they even asked how to find it themselves. As the seconds started counting down and the launch began, I heard applause and cheering from the people in the bleachers, but I wasn't seeing what they were seeing. What was it that they were seeing? There was no rocket, no smoke, no fire to the east in the direction that the guide had told us to look. Somebody in our part of the crowd yelled, "It's over there, to the north, not to the east," where the guide had told us to look. I had specifically chosen my position so that I had a decent view of the east skyline because of the guide's instructions, but where the launch was actually happening, there was this giant tree blocking the view, and the people who had set up in this area where I set up finally saw the rocket once it was far above the tree because we were looking in the wrong direction. I paid $90 for this, and it was infuriating. But I'm not somebody who holds bitterness within my heart just for the sake of being bitter. Or am I? So I thought to myself, what lessons could I learn from this experience? And what lessons could I share with somebody else who might want to have the same experience? Well, first of all, and I've had actually a couple of months to think about this since, don't go to the Kennedy Space Center specifically to watch a rocket launch. At least not an average everyday rocket launch. Later on, I started looking at their website, and the Artemis 1 launch carrying Orion, the spacecraft that was supposed to go to the moon, had a different viewing site. And to watch the Artemis launch was $250, just specifically to watch the launch. That's a lot of freaking money to watch a rocket launch. I mean, I get that it's historic, and I'm guessing, knowing what I know now, that those people who watched space shuttle launches probably paid a lot of money in their time too. But it was not from that general North Point viewing area that I went and watched this SpaceX Falcon launch. I mean, it was pretty cool once it got above the horizon and I saw it. I mean, it has this very unique sound to it. I can't even recreate it, but it has this very unique, memorable sound to it. The fire that's coming out of that rocket, out of that rocket fuel coming out of its butt, is such an intense color, something you've never seen before. And as I was looking on my phone there, waiting for the rocket to launch, I started to realize that there were all these other nearby beaches where you could watch and get a much better view. You'd have a direct view of the rocket taking off. Something else that I learned, that there were several launch pads, one after another, after another, after another. One is NASA, one is SpaceX, and one is Blue Origin, and there's just all these different companies nowadays involved in launching rockets. So I think in theory you could have a good view of one of them, but not the others. If you had a good view of SpaceX, you may not have a good view of Blue Origin or NASA or whatever. I don't know. If anybody has more knowledge than I do, I'll message me and I'll share it on the show. I mean, I had a fun time that day and there were a lot of great things. I listened to an astronaut speak about his time in space, which was really interesting to hear. A lot more interesting than I thought it would be. And I rode some rides that were kind of MGM style, where, there was a movie screen in front of your face and then the chairs rocked to make you feel like you were traveling through space. It was kind of an amusement park for nerds. As you were getting jolted around, you were getting an education as well, So it wasn't a total loss. I'm just not sure I would have paid $90 for it if I had known what I know now. I went back home and I started thinking about these rockets. They're going up to space, and it's only a few hours away from where I live. I'm it's going all the way up to space. So I thought about it. In theory, it's like I should be able to see it from where I live too, right? So one day after work, I just went out to the main street and I looked up and there it was, launching up into space. I hadn't clocked out yet. I got paid for it. Got paid to watch a rocket launch. Then I thought, well, if I can see this from work, surely I can see this from the beach. So anytime there's like a night launch, I run down to the local beach and I just watch it from there. And it's totally cool from there too. I mean, I can't actually see the rocket itself, but not in HD, it's off in the distance. And mostly I just see like fire in the sky. And I can watch it go from ground level up into space. One thing I'm surprised is that it kind of goes east more than it goes up. I just kind of thought it would shoot straight up into the sky, like vertically the entire time. No, not really. I've tried multiple times taking photographs of it, but it hasn't worked out yet. I got a blurry image once because I wasn't prepared. I spent the time screwing around with with long exposures and totally forgot to be actually ready for the launch itself. And then every time I've tried to go back, there have been these delays for ridiculous reasons, like, oh, it could go up into the clouds and there could be lightning up there and it could strike the rocket. And I think about how much as a viewer, how frustrating that is. And then I think about what would it be like to work there and have that happen. It's like you're anticipating this thing this entire time and then it doesn't happen. Imagine the people that paid $250 to see Artemis launch, just to have it delayed by a gas leak once. It got delayed for a couple of days, and then there was the gas leak another time. And then after the second time they tried to launch, they decided to put it back in Bay, which was going to be another month away. And then Hurricane Ian, which is coming through town right now as I speak, pretty much hit Cape Canaveral head on, after crossing Florida from the West Coast. So they had to put Artemis back inside for another 3 weeks. So very frustrating. As a fan, and I can imagine as somebody who works there, it's got to be even more infuriating. But it's so cool watching the rockets take off. Like, it's this very unique experience to be able to watch that from the local beach where I live. And honestly, I'm with as many delays as there's been, I'm not sure I'd take the 2-hour trip back to Cape Canaveral to watch it in person, and I certainly would not pay $90 to see it. I think if I ever do go back down there to watch a rocket launch, it'll be from one of the local beaches where all the other people take photos. Let me look here. According to visitspacecoast.com, you can go kayaking and watch the rocket launch from the water, or you can go to Exploration Tower, which I have no idea what that is, or go to Laurie Wilson Park or Spaceview Park, which seems ideal by name, Parish Park in Titusville, Sydney Fisher Park. Like, there's all these different parks where you can watch the rocket launch from for free. And I think if I go back, I'll go to one of those places instead of paying $90 to get back into the Kennedy Space Center. All right, you've been listening to The Great Beginner Galactic. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks for listening to the show. The Great Big Intergalactic can be heard on Spreaker, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, Apple iTunes, and anywhere else that podcasts can be heard. If social media is your thing, you can follow the program on Facebook or Twitter. If you enjoy the show, upvote, share, like, and subscribe whenever and wherever those things can be done. If you'd like to send feedback, the easiest way to do that is to email the show at tgbiuniverse@gmail.com. TGBI as in the Great Big Intergalactic. Or you can leave a voicemail at 216-200-7940. Contributions could include written feedback, audio submissions, voicemails, or potentially even live guests. It was great having you today, and see you next time.